Hey, Patricia.
Hello, Kim.
How are you doing? How was your weekend?
Oh, I don't know what a weekend is anymore. I got a lot of writing done over the weekend, and that is after a long week of work here at the gallery or teaching. You know, it was funny, on Friday evening, I called my sister who works night shifts because I think it is a Monday. And I'm like, she's probably available. And she's like, no, I'm not. It's a Friday. That's how confusing it gets. And today we have people working here, fixing the walls and floors in the rooms that were flooded with water when one of the pipes exploded over the winter break. So, surprise, I am in the vault today, surrounded by works of art from our collection. So you're gonna hear a little bit of the vents, and I apologize in advance. I'm starting to think that being nomadic is sort of my thing. I can't really escape it. As soon as I settle and I feel comfortable, it is time to get up and go again. But how are you?
First of all, what the listeners aren't seeing is that I can see you and the vault looks so cool. But I definitely hear that climate control system. So that's fun. Because today it's very exciting. We actually have two art conservators in the studio. Just a little about my weekend. It was great. Last week was a little crazy. Also, I feel a little dizzy from it. I had two studio visits. One was from the Pitzer Art Galleries. Emily Butts is the new director, and she's fantastic, and she has such a great vision for the gallery. As you know, a college art gallery is really dependent on the curator and director having a clear vision of what they want to share and communicate. And I'm so excited to see what Emily does there. But enough about that stuff. I want to get to talking with our two guests. This is so exciting. Welcome to The Art Equation.
Welcome to The Art Equation, a podcast from Now Be Here. I'm one of your hosts, Patricia Ortega, and our historian and independent curator.
I'm your other host, Kim Schoenstatt, a contemporary artist and organizer of Now Be Here, a directory of and for women and non-binary artists.
On this podcast, we have a little charla, a little bachipapo about making art and making exhibitions. We invite fellow artists, curators, archivists, and people from different areas of the art world to share their knowledge and their experience.
We are curious about what goes on in the day-to-day of arting. We want to talk shop, get in the weeds about what goes into art shows, talk with the makers and the doers of the art world. Welcome to The Art Equation. Today we're sitting down with a few members from the conservation department at the Getty Research Institute. For listeners, the Getty is an art institution that has many parts. There's the Getty Research Institute, or the GRI, the Getty Conservation Institute, the Getty Museum, and the Getty Foundation. Today we have two paper conservators from the GRI.
Yes, I want to give them a warm welcome and just tell all our listeners that we have invited them on the podcast to talk about their path. We want to know what conservation is all about and what are some of the most exciting and relevant aspects of their work. We'll just quickly read a short bio for each of our two guests so our listeners can get to know you both.
One of our guests is Melissa Huddleston. Melissa has worked in collection care for museum and private collections throughout Los Angeles since 2007. She has been employed at the Getty Research Institute Department of Conservation and Preservation since 2014. She's an assistant conservator specializing in treatment, housing, and installation solutions for modern and contemporary archive materials. Melissa holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in studio art with a focus in painting from the Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. She recently exhibited a new body of her paintings at Luis de Jesus in Los Angeles. And that was a great show, by the way.
And our other guest is Elyse Driscoll. Elyse is an associate conservator at the Getty Research Institute. She has previously held paper conservation positions at the Brooklyn Museum and the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. She holds a BFA from Pratt Institute and an MA and CAS in art conservation with a specialization in works on paper from SUNY Buffalo State University. Her training included graduate internships at the Morgan Library and Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and the Williamstown Art Conservation Center. Oh my gosh,
Wow.
This is a luxury today. Thank you both for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you. Excited to join you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
We are super excited to be talking with our conservators, Elyse and Melissa. You are the second round of guests on the podcast. We've only had one guest so far. And it is actually my first time sitting down with conservators. I appreciate the work that you do, and I am very curious to hear about you and your experiences in this work. I personally do not know a whole lot about conservators. I think of you guys as a mix between a chemist, an artist, and an art historian. And I only know this because I have visited the London Conservation Center at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art here in DC, where they have these workshops slash studios that are open to the public. You can actually walk by and see through glass walls the conservators at work in real time. It's a very cool thing.
Yeah, and I mean, this is why we wanted to have conservators on, is because we think it's a little bit opaque as to what you guys do. You're like these magic people behind the scenes who make the art stay alive. But, you know, of course, I think of conservators as the people that us artists call when we get into trouble and need to fix stuff. So I'm excited to clarify maybe some misconceptions about your profession. So are we at all in the ballpark of what you do?
I would say yes.
Yeah, I think there's conservators in different settings. So some conservators may have a private practice, and maybe they're the ones that would deal more directly with the general public or artists. And then conservators like us that would work in an institution. So we're more focused on, for us, like programming the collection and like curatorial requests related to the collection. So
Yeah, and in the case of our collection, because we're a research archive, we also have to consider how the objects might be interacted with by scholars and people who come to access them in the reading room. But that's kind of us specifically. And I think I would say one more thing that conservators do for contemporary artists is kind of act as a consultant, as artists are, choosing materials. And I think usually that would be a very successful artist who kind of had the resources to work with a conservator.
So what you're talking about is outside conservators who are freelancers.
Sure, yeah.
I have a question. We have some questions prepared that we'd love for you both to answer as they apply to you and your experience. And since you're talking about the sort of more specific aspects of the profession, I want to ask you, what kind of art conservator are you?
So my training was in paper. I'm apprentice trained. I began working at the Getty Research Institute in 2014. And at that point, the only training I had was in paper. But because our collection has so many different kinds of objects in it, I sort of slowly started learning about these different materials. We have a lot of plastics in our collection. Our Fluxus collection just has a huge variety of types of materials. So over the years, I've taken different workshops, worked with other conservators, and if something is way outside of my expertise, maybe we'll bring in a outside conservator to consult on it or even to do a treatment. But I've taken on a lot of those kind of oddball objects in our collection. A lot of that ends up being preventative conservation. So learning about what specific conditions different plastics need. Yeah, really just a variety of materials. We have food in our collection, we have costumes, we have props from performance artists.
I think you have some body fluids too.
We do. We have some blood. We have urine. We have, not just like a jar of urine, but we have Dieter Roth's urine book.
Wait a second. Is that a setup for a joke? Like, did it spring a leak?
No, I hope it never springs a leak because that would be really disgusting. But yeah, over the years, I've kind of taken on more of those odd projects. And so at this point, I'm usually referred to as specializing in modern and contemporary archive materials.
Oh, interesting. And Elyse, how about you?
I'm also trained as a paper conservator. So that would be all works on paper, drawings, prints, documents. But again, at the GRI, because the collection is so broad, it kind of busts out of that zone. And the same at the Brooklyn Museum, where I was for a number of years in that encyclopedic collection. I worked on papyrus, Egyptian papyrus there quite a bit, and Asian paintings, so like screens and scrolls. And, sometimes prints are on different supports than paper. So it would be a print on plexi or a print on metal. There's always these opportunities, I think, to collaborate with people outside of your specialty and these challenges that come up. That's always really exciting, even though my true love works on paper.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So you're in the archives. There is also a museum. So what's the difference between a conservator working with an archive and a conservator at a museum?
I mean, I still work on exhibitions at the GRI, so there's a lot of similarities. But I think one of the main things that sticks out is that the collection is accessible to scholars and researchers. Kind of like considering that when you're planning on treatment and preparing things for storage, just having that in your mind, that it's not just going to be this small group of people that could be handling it.
Yeah, and it can come into decision making for treatments as well. There are instances in an archive where something that might be considered damage on an artwork is considered a record of use on an archive object. So that's a pretty big difference, but it's very case by case.
Interesting.
We also our department helps readers with handling the collection. So when there are things that are a little bit more fragile, we help provide access to that in the reading room.
So I'm hearing a lot from both of you that there is a lot of learning as you do, right? Because you're not expecting to work with certain materials or substances. And so that got me thinking about the curriculum. What do an art conservator gets to learn in a program for art conservation? I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, so there are a few graduate training programs in the U.S. for conservation, and they have prerequisites that you have to complete prior to going to graduate school. And a lot of people come into those programs from a background in art history, studio arts, or the sciences, and oftentimes have to go back to school a little bit to prepare to apply to grad school. So and you intern really typically before going to grad school. So you come into grad school with some experience, and the programs are structured differently, but they typically involve you working on all types of materials because they do all kind of speak to each other. You might do something in your paintings conservation coursework that will help you kind of problem solve something in paper conservation. But it's impossible really they're 3 to 4 year programs, graduate programs, and it's really impossible to cover everything that you would ever see. And the field is always developing in terms of like materials and approaches even just to conservation work. And then you might be in an institution where you're responsible for Asian paintings and you have to kind of scramble to get that kind of training. And that's something I really love about it. It is a field where you're always learning, and we all learn from each other in our lab, and the field in general is small but very collaborative, so you can usually call on other people that might have expertise in certain materials to help advise your projects.
And so at the end of the program, what do you do? Do you graduate just because you took all your courses, or is there like some benchmarks or something that you have to meet?
No, there's usually summer internships in between 2 to 3 academic years, and then the programs in the US have a final year that is a graduate internship. And that's kind of this nice way to transition from being in school to working in a lab, but you're still a student. And then there's
Wait, so they just throw you right in the deep end?
Kind of, but it's like,
okay, you're half baked.
But you're a graduate intern, so you're in a lab that typically has a lot of experience mentoring, and that's actually a huge part of our job too, is mentoring. So you kind of like pay it forward quite a bit. But it is this nice transition because you're getting into the day-to-day of a museum full-time before you're more thrown in the deep end. And there's a lot of postgraduate fellowships, and that has been for a long time a typical route. Like a conservator that's recently graduated might even have several multi-year postgraduate fellowships before something permanent comes up for them.
I just find that to be so fascinating because it seems to me it sort of retains something of like the old art workshops, right? Like back in the Renaissance, where you had artists working together, and this idea of sort of mentorship or learning from each other, camaraderie, makes me think of artist guilds, right, in the old times. But just to clarify, when you say paper conservator, that means drawing and prints. And does that mean photography, like paper print photographs and posters, I imagine?
Yeah, photography is like a subspecialty,
Okay.
and we have a conservator in our department that specializes specifically on photography, but it was also part of my training and work that I did at the Brooklyn Museum and that I do at the GRI. Like, we have a huge photo collection at the GRI, so...
And what happens when you have, like, let's say mixed media, when you have a canvas that has paper or photographs or, you know, like collages, or even an installation that has multiple media? How do you work on that?
That's a great question. It can be pretty tricky. I would say working on it, you would work on each piece based on what was appropriate for that particular part. It can get pretty tricky when it comes to preventative preservation or preventative conservation. So certain types of photographs need to be stored in like cold storage, whereas other elements might be fine in a regular vault. And so questions do come up sometimes how to preserve an item overall when there's these sort of materials mixed together that have different needs.
Right. It's not like when you're sleeping and you get hot and you stick your foot outside the bed. Like, you can't just take the foot outside the bed. It's a whole object.
I love that. Put a little blankie over the scrapbook and let the like photo just like poke out from the little blanket. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think just going back, like if it was a painting or something, just reaching out to colleagues. And we're fortunate at the Getty that we're kind of in our own little bubble where we do have paintings conservators and objects conservators right there. But then also like just reaching out to the broader conservation community and colleagues at other institutions we've worked on to tap into their expertise.
I wanted to see if you can talk about your favorite object you've worked with. If you have any in mind that you would like to share, we'd love to hear about that.
I can go first. So recently I had the great honor of working on a costume that was worn by a feminist performance group that came out of the women's building in the late 70s called the Waitresses. They would do these sort of guerrilla style performances in cafes throughout Los Angeles, where they would sort of take over the front of the house staff and interact with the guests at the diner and do these really amazing kind of monologues and sketches. And their work was really focused on women's rights in the workplace and sexual harassment in the workplace, and kind of using the waitress as a symbol for sort of a woman's plight in the world globally. I think they're just really brilliant artists. And one of the costumes that they wore, Anne Gauldin wore it, and she also made it. It was a dress where they cast their breasts in latex and sewed them to the front of the dress. So it was sort of
amazing,
riffing on the goddess Diana, you know, the great fertility goddess. And then she had this monologue that she would do where she would stand up on the table in the middle of the cafe and deliver this monologue about how hard it is to be this all-nurturing goddess.
Wow.
It's a really, really compelling, amazing object. And the Getty acquired it in 2018, I believe. And when we received it in the lab, the latex of the breasts had begun to really deteriorate and warp and kind of crack apart. And the way latex deteriorates, it kind of gets soft and sticky, and then it sort of collapses and then hardens into that shape. And if you can catch it in time, it is possible to, with heat, to kind of reform the latex. But it's always going to be part of the degradation process that it will collapse. And so it's really important to find a way to support it. So that treatment was really fun. I learned a lot. It was really scary at certain moments. It was definitely a treatment that there weren't a lot of examples. There were a few examples of similar treatments, but a lot of it was really problem solving, and there was a lot of collaboration. I worked with costume conservators and people who specialized in modern materials to develop a treatment plan for it. So because of the material itself and the object itself being so compelling, but also the history of it, that would probably be my favorite project.
So the Getty has on their website a little story about the breast dress.
Okay.
We'll link to it in the episode notes. And in the picture, which I encourage everybody to go see, you're going to see Anne wearing the dress, and the breasts all look very different. I'm fascinated by that because, you know, as ladies, we all do have different shapes and sizes. And so what's the story with all of the different boobs?
Okay, first I'm going to say now I see the title, which is Ready to Order, which I think is a fantastic title.
That's hilarious.
That was the title of that piece, 1978. Well, this is a little bit, I'll answer your question, but it sort of takes away a little bit of the mystique of the dress.
Okay.
So,
Well, maybe we leave the mystique.
okay, we could leave the mystique. We could leave the mystique.
So that's a continued conversation.
Okay, that could be a continued
That's for
conversation.
another time. All right,
Yeah.
Elise, I'm dying to know, what's your favorite object?
That I have a really hard time answering that question, actually, but probably along the lines of what Melissa was talking about. I tend to really enjoy projects that are big and collaborative and a little bit of a challenge and maybe a little scary at first, intimidating at first. So some things that come to mind is this Andrea Bowers piece that I worked on from the Brooklyn Museum, which was this huge cardboard piece that had to be hung on the wall. She had developed this mounting system that had actually changed over time, I think, because of some of the challenges with the mounting system. But it was these canvas loops on the back that you would hang on hooks. And this piece was going out for a loan, and we hung it up in an empty gallery at the Brooklyn Museum. And some of the canvas loops had failed. And so I really needed assistance from paintings conservators and objects conservators to kind of sew and reinforce the canvas. But then this piece, it's actually multiple panels that Velcro together, and it's really difficult to assemble those pieces. And then it's incredibly heavy to hang on the wall. So it always involved like 4 other art handlers. And then packing it to travel was also another challenge. So, and then more recently, we actually have a kinetic sculpture, outdoor sculpture on loan at the GRI as part of our current exhibition on experiments in technology, that we kind of also had this team to clean it periodically. And
Is this the giant...
Osaka one, it's like a fiberglass dome.
Yeah, that kind of like slowly moves around like a Roomba.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
like a giant top of a Tic Tac.
Yeah.
Yeah, that thing's amazing.
Yeah, I
and
know.
it moved so slowly that you
was
didn't
like-
perceive that it was moving. But then when I came out of the GRI, I was like, it's in a different place.
Yeah. Yeah, it would like bump off. It bumps off of these bolsters that we had to set up on the plaza level and would sometimes get stuck.
Yeah.
We have to wheel it out. So I did enjoy, we had a conservator from the Getty's Deck Arts department working on that and a couple of our mount makers. And when it was installed, there were some technical couriers. They were objects conservators in private practice that specialize in modern and contemporary and were like quite knowledgeable about the object. And so it was fun to meet people, collaborate with people, learn about things. And yeah.
You got me thinking about degradation and loss. And I wonder how you feel about that. I mean, you are a conservator. Your job is to preserve these objects as long as you can. But how do you deal with that? And then do you hate artists who just want their works to be lost or degraded?
No, I think that it's helpful if an artist has, and you have that information of like what they want for their work, because that's super important to us. So I think that knowing what they want and honoring that as a conservator.
How do you know what they want?
In previous institutions I worked for, we had artist questionnaires. The artists didn't always respond to them. But,
so you have an object and you're like, wait, I need to know more. And then you find the artist's website and hopefully they list their work.
Or just
email.
talking with the artist and the artist studio.
Got
And
it.
yeah. How they want something displayed, understanding the risks of displaying something a certain way. Yeah, some artists might like the look of deteriorated masking tape on their work, but they don't want it to fall off. So yeah, it's kind of fun too. Like I think problem solving those solutions.
Yeah.
Is it sad for you though when something you're just watching it kind of fall apart?
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes it is sad. And sometimes there's nothing you can do. And I think at that point, you try to document it as well as you can. There's always conversations about making replicas, facsimiles, things like that. And those are usually pretty collaborative conversations with curators and art historians. And if the artist is no longer living, or with the artist as well, if they're still living. Yeah, it can be sad.
So like an exhibition copy. Like sometimes a work is so delicate that you just make a copy of it and then you can show that in full light and it can travel all over. And if it falls apart, who cares?
That can happen. Sometimes that's a solution for sure. Sometimes I think something can appear like it's in this state of decay and it's sort of lost. And then you can have a conversation with the artist and see it in a completely different way. I'm thinking of a book that was in the Barbara T. Smith show that was cellulose nitrate pages.
Yeah.
And it was, they were done on a photocopier. And it was sort of divided by these brightly colored acrylic sheets, like rigid acrylic. By the time it came to us, the pages had sort of warped really dramatically and were kind of sticking to each other. And we had a lot of conversations about how we should handle this. Should we make a replica? We thought it was meant to be experienced as a book in a very kind of traditional way. So we were really thinking about how to flatten these really warped pages. And then when Barbara came to talk about this object with us, she told us that actually that warping had happened by the photocopier from the heat of the photocopier, and that she thought it looked cool. And so she kind of embraced it, and that actually when she had made it, it really was more like a sculpture. The pages were so warped and wrinkly that they sort of created this like sun ray effect of like a dome. Imagine like a half dome on a table.
Yeah, it has a topography to it.
Exactly. And so she kind of had accepted, you'll never be able to, quote unquote, read this, but it became kind of more of a sculpture in her mind. So then it was kind of like, okay, well, it is still deteriorating, but what we thought was the solution wouldn't at all be the solution if we were going to try to preserve it as the way she intended it to be. So
yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating. I was just going to say, this live of art objects that you get to witness. It's so interesting. I can imagine a whole book that can be written about the post-exhibition life of a work of art, right? This behind the scenes, this sort of secret life of materials. How are you thinking about these things?
We did have a study day, and the GRI Conservation Department does host these study days where we gather people that have some kind of expertise in the area to kind of have these discussions.
Because I would imagine that just having her be like, no, it shouldn't be flat, was like this just lens shift for you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Melissa, I want to shift a little bit. You're walking two worlds. You're both an artist and an art conservator. Can you talk about the dialogue that happens?
Yeah, I definitely think being an artist is sort of how I found my path into conservation. So I wouldn't be a conservator if I hadn't first been an artist. And absolutely my work in conservation has informed my art practice immensely and just given me amazing resources and knowledge really to bring into my studio. I guess I sort of have come to think of it as almost two sides of a coin. I feel like working in conservation is a real service-oriented kind of work. I want to forget myself in a way when I come to an object and really think about what that object needs, maybe what the artist intended, what the right thing to do is. And it's a space where maybe you could even say selfless, or that's the goal. Whereas when I'm in my studio, that's my world. You know, I can do whatever I want and it's for me. So even though some of the physical hand skills are in common, or just a very deep interest in art is a commonality, like when it comes to the motivation, they're almost opposites.
Right, like being an artist, you're speaking for yourself. You're communicating your ideas to the world. And being a conservator, you're communicating that artist's ideas to the world. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Interesting. So interesting. And Elyse, there was an article about a project that you did at the Brooklyn Museum, and it was using something called the multi-band reflectance imaging. Did I get that right? Because I don't really understand what that even is.
Yeah, multi-band imaging, this in a nutshell, would be using a modified digital camera, so it's capable of imaging beyond the visible area of the electromagnetic spectrum, so into infrared and UV, and you can use these different filters, they're called bandpass filters, that would image an object in a specific region of the electromagnetic spectrum. So typically colorants is what we're looking at, or what my research was looking at, because colorants respond to radiation differently. They might like absorb or reflect infrared in specific regions, or absorb infrared in one region and reflect it in another region. You can use imaging to help characterize colorants. So that research project was using this technique that was developed at the Smithsonian to identify indigo. We had this exhibition on blue at the Brooklyn Museum, and my colleagues and I were looking at different objects in preparation for this exhibition and trying to use this technique from the Smithsonian, struggling a little bit with it based on the information that was published. So a lot of that work was just trying to streamline the workflow and understand that technique while also identifying these blue colorants.
And that kind of information helps you then say, hey, when you're showing this, these are better conditions to keep them under?
That, and I mean, there was like a curatorial interest in what the materials are and what that says about an object and the history of the object and how we understand.
By seeing it in these different ways, you understand what materials were used.
Yeah, like the use of indigo in combination with Prussian blue and Japanese woodblock prints at a specific time in history. There was that art historical interest. And then it does inform how we might display something? Is a pigment in this object super light sensitive, and do we want to display it for a shorter period of time or at lower light levels? Or maybe it doesn't go on tour for multiple venues because we want to preserve that colorant. Some colorants are really pH sensitive, so that might affect how we would store it long term, or the materials that we would frame it in for display, or in a casework, how we would display it. And then also our conservation treatment. So maybe our conservation treatments, we adjust pH a lot.
How do you adjust pH?
In paper conservation, we typically add like calcium carbonate to water, or ammonium hydroxide is something else to raise the pH. So,
and then do you like, I mean, sorry to be asking really dumb questions. Do you like paint it on? Like, how do you, or do you give it like a sauna? Like, how does that work?
Sometimes.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, humidifying things. We use water in paper conservation treatment a lot, which might be like a surprise. We wash paper. We can treat stains locally in different ways, and raising the pH can make a treatment more effective. It typically will swell the paper fibers more so we can get stains and discoloration out, but it could also have a negative impact on some media. So you want to raise it enough to maximize the outcome of your treatment, but you don't want to raise it so much if you're going to shift the way a color looks or undermine like a printing ink or something.
There's a lot of testing involved. Maybe we should also
Yeah.
say, before you begin a treatment, there's a lot of ways you can test the material, test the media in a very tiny, inconspicuous place to see how it's going to respond to whatever you're about to do. I mean, the most obvious example is with inks. You always would test for water solubility before you introduce water as part of a treatment.
That makes sense. Yeah, I like this idea of testing.
Yeah, there's a lot of testing.
So what are you working on right now?
I am currently working on an exhibition called $3 Bill, Evidence of Queer Lives, that will open June 10th, curated by Pietro Rigolo. There's a lot of objects in it, and it's sort of a survey / celebration / kind of intimate peek into the archives of LGBTQ plus artists. And it begins with works by early 20th century artists. There's this amazing artist named Elisar von Kupffer, who was a poet and a playwright and an activist. And he made really beautiful photographs of himself in these erotic settings, sort of playing with gender. And his work is sort of in the beginning of the show, and then it goes through the liberation movements and goes through to today. So it's a broad show. There's a lot of different perspectives within the exhibition, and the materials are really compelling, really beautiful. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to spend time with those materials, and a lot of materials in the show. One of our curators uses the description of, you can't put that on a t-shirt. So there's definitely some
explicit content.
Some explicit content.
That's great. Bring it
and
on.
some great surprises. There's some really amazing Mapplethorpe sculptures. There's some works by a Karuk artist named Brian Tripp, and I've just started looking at those pieces, and I'm really excited to learn more about him. He passed away in 2020, but I believe he was really instrumental in bringing back some of the traditional dances and ceremonial practices of the Karuk people. I'm just sort of starting to look at the object, so I still have a lot to learn too, but it's really a great set of materials to be spending time with right now, and I think just so, in a way, painfully necessary in our culture right now to celebrate these artists and to spend time with their archives.
I'm excited to see the show. And what are you working on, Elyse?
I'm working on an exhibition called What They Saw, and it features some objects from our special collection, photo books by women, and then we'll actually have a fair amount of books from the general circulating collection that like people can handle and look at. It's actually a pop-up show in between our current exhibition and $3 bill. And I am also preparing previous exhibitions for travel. And we have a previous exhibition that's in Mexico City right now. And Melissa's helping with that as well. And I am working on a partnership between the GRI, the Conservation Institute, the GCI, and the Studio Museum in Harlem to carry out analysis and treatment on some prints by Mavis Pusey in preparation for a traveling exhibition that will eventually land back at the Studio Museum for their reopening. I also mentor a very talented graduate intern right now, so dabbling in her projects here and there. And we do testing on materials that are used in exhibition casework and frames and in storage. And we're getting that up and running at the GRI soon.
Oh my God. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Holy cow. Oh my God, I could keep talking with them for hours.
I know, me too. We should just keep talking.
And it's exciting because even though I do have some insight, like full disclosure, my husband is an art conservator at the GRI, and that's how I have access to these amazing people, but they also just said yes because they're great. But I still don't really understand it. It's such an important field within the arts, and yet it's still such a mystery. It's like these magic people just make things happen, and we kind of forget that the magic takes years of research and learning and hours and hours and hours of work just to make sure that an object can be enjoyed. It's really incredible. But yes, we were wrapping up because we don't want to keep you forever. We want to let you back to your objects. We do have an ending question. It's very blue sky, very expansive. Go with it wherever you want. But what project would you do if you had unlimited funding and time?
I would probably pick, I've been at the GRI for 2 years now, and I typically work on exhibitions. So I would love to do a collection survey. I'd love to spend more time in storage and get better acquainted with the collection as a whole. I love prints. So that's probably an area that I would just want to familiarize myself with more at the GRI.
It is really amazing just to have the experience of being able to go into these vaults and open up the drawers and see what's there. And it does take time and money to be able to do that. We go to work and we have responsibilities that we're expected to accomplish, and there's not always time to just go and kind of explore. Well, I thought about it in a very blue sky kind of way.
Yay, go blue.
And I also will say, having worked at the Getty for 10 years now, I've worked on some projects with some pretty massive budgets. And it has felt like, wow, we're so lucky that we get to spend this time on these things. Definitely would put the breast dress in that category. So I feel like in a way I've really had that privilege, and I'm really grateful for it. I think I'm going to take this in a totally different direction and say that unlimited time and money, I think I've thought a lot about how much I've benefited from being a part of the conservation community. As an artist, I've benefited so much from it, and the amount that I've learned about materials. I've always thought it would be really amazing to have a place like a studio or an institute of some kind that's a mixture of a library of materials and also resources having to do with materials. So a place where there could be conservators on staff, there could be fabricators on staff. I don't know. There could be whatever staffing you needed to run the place. And I think it would be amazing to have this place where artists could go and really explore materials. I think artists put so much time into searching for the right materials to make their work. And I don't really think material science is taught in art school very much. And so it's considered this kind of old-fashioned thing. But if art is a language and the materials you're using are kind of the words, I think that that would just be such an amazing thing for artists.
So it'd be like a drop-in center.
I think it would be like a drop-in center. There could be like a printmaking studio. There could be, but it wouldn't be a place to go and make finished work. It would be a place to go and do research, like material research.
Right. Like, here's what I want to do. Here's my vision. I don't know how to do this. What glue do I use? What linen do I use?
Exactly.
Can I put like Sharpie on linen and have it not eat through it?
Exactly. And to be able to feel things and touch things and test things out and see like what would happen if I 3D printed this, or I want to make a sculpture. I want it to be in a metal. What metal? How do the different metals behave? A place to just really just like study materials. And I think I really love when an idea and a material have this beautiful marriage in a way that just like clicks. And I think that the de-skilling of art is a thing, and craft has this old-fashioned idea that if you're interested in craft, that means you're interested in like mastering a craft to make something perfect. But it's not about that at all. It's just about knowing your material to make it whatever you want it to be. So that would be my blue sky thing.
That's a good blue sky.
I love it.
Yeah, it
Or
would
just,
be
like,
amazing.
These artists that are already like renowned that do have access to that,
Mhm.
like thinking about like Ruscha's like Pepto-Bismol prints, or like what Rauschenberg was doing at Gemini, and like they have that special access. So it would be really great for everybody to have that special access.
Yeah, exactly.
And finally, we want to wrap up with some thank yous. Thank you to Melissa and Elyse for being here. Thank you to Sky Park Tausig for being our amazing producer, Taras Matla at the University of Maryland Art Gallery, and Jonathan Formansky for letting us use your music.
Thanks everyone for listening, and thank you Melissa and Elyse for joining us today. We will be back in 2 weeks here in the Art Equation. Bye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey folks, Melissa provided us a small correction regarding the book we discussed from Barbara T. Smith's Coffin series. The material Smith printed on for that particular book was cellulose acetate, not cellulose nitrate. Thanks for listening.
We are The Art Equation. You can find us wherever you listen every other Thursday.
Thanks for being here with us. We'd really love to hear your thoughts. So please subscribe. And if you have a moment to leave a review, it really helps us out. We love the feedback. Talk to you soon here on The Art Equation. The Art Equation is a podcast from Now Be Here with support from the University of Maryland Art Gallery. Now Be Here is a directory and resource created by and for women and non-binary artists. You can find more information at www.nowbehereart.com.